So this PowerPoint is in regards to making brain connections for our textbook by Janet Zadina. And this PowerPoint is used in class session and in lecture. So I just wanted to go over some of the information to make sure in case you were not in class, you do have some access to it. But just so you know, this PowerPoint is not meant to be a standalone outside the classroom activities. It is meant to be used in class along with instructor lecture. So one of the first things I wanted to emphasize is that reading is not normal. You're not born knowing how to read. It's not instinctual. In fact, many formalized years are spent learning how to read. If you think back to your elementary education, if you are in public school, essentially pre-K, preschool through fourth grade, there is formalized, deliberate instruction in how to read. After fourth grade, basically what happens is you are using reading to learn about other information. But until that point, you are given direct instruction on the skill of reading. And reading is not stagnant. It is your reading levels and your reading capabilities and lexiles, they change over time. They go up and down all through your lifetime, depending on how much they're being used, how they're being used, those kinds of things. So it's an ongoing thing. It's not like you just learn to read and then you're done. It is always an ongoing process of your reading levels. But reading is incredibly complicated. So there's no single area in the brain devoted to reading. In order for reading to take place, connections have to be made all over the brain in order for that process. It's a very complicated process. And in fact, humans are pretty much the only animal that is able to read. Now you can argue, they made some progress with things like gorillas, those kinds of things, but very, very limited. Reading is an active process, not passive. And what that means is you are purposely doing something with the material to help understand it and remember it. So these are things like you preview information, you kind of get a lay of the land, look things over, kind of like a roadmap. You question, you are questioning for the purpose of reading. So in other words, your reading is answering those questions that you have about the text. While you are reading, you're connecting to what you already know, connecting with your prior knowledge. And then it's very important that you outline or map or draw your interpretation of information for understanding. So remember, you are reading to understand. You're not reading to memorize. The purpose of reading is to understand information. So it's very important that you monitor your understanding and be well aware when you are not understanding information as you read. So don't forget to also use pictures, headings, subtitles, all those kinds of things to help utilize in order to make sense of the information. So while you are reading, you need to make sense of it and make sure you understand it. So always monitor your comprehension. Critical reading is a complex thinking technique. You discover and you take apart an author's meaning. Essentially, you're kind of picking things apart to put them back together for understanding. And you're making evaluations. You're evaluating the author's meaning, kind of incorporating or embedding it into what you already know that's connected with your prior knowledge. You are prioritizing the author's ideas, trying to decide, okay, what's the most important idea? While you're previewing, you're asking questions before you read. You want to recognize patterns when you are reading. All of these things help you understand the material better. I do want to emphasize that critical reading is not about memorization. Students make that mistake. If you think reading a chapter to memorize it, that's not going to make you successful in college. Number one, there's just way, way too much information. But it is really to help you understand so that you can apply that information in various forms. So we talked about that reading is an active process. Active means you're doing. Most of us engage in passive. Passive is when essentially you see someone looking at a book, but you're not actually doing anything. So take a look at these. This is meant to be an in-class activity. And for each one of these, 1 through 10, identify, is this an active or is this passive? So go ahead, hit pause on the video and choose active or passive for each of these 1 through 10. Okay, so we're going to go through these. Number 1, reading a textbook chapter from beginning to end straight through. That's passive. If all you're doing is just reading, you're looking at it going straight through, you're not giving your time brain to process, you're not actually doing anything with the text, you're not writing questions, you're not engaging with the text, that is definitely a passive. And that doesn't work well for your brain anyways. Your brain likes chunking. So when you are reading, you want to go in short sections, stop, check your understanding, check your comprehension, map, draw, outline to make sure you do have a good understanding. Number 2, write down everything your professor says during a lecture. Again, this is passive. This is not active. You may think you need to write down everything, but actually, if you're just writing down everything, you're just kind of copying whatever they're saying, and you're not really thinking about it. You're not engaging with that critical thinking. So believe it or not everything that comes out of your professor's mouth is a pearl of wisdom. So it's much, much better if you focus and be select in what you're writing down. Remember, you're interpreting the author's meaning. So when the instructor is lecturing, is this important? Am I going to need to know this for a test? You should always be thinking in context. Number 3, rewriting your lecture notes. This is active. Now, there's a difference between rewriting and recopying. Rewriting means you are doing it in a different format, you're writing it a different way, using different words, you're thinking about what you are writing. That's active. When you recopy, all you're doing is copying over and there's no brain work involved. That's why if you copy off someone else's notes, it's good, you might need the information, but it's not really helping your brain any. It's not helping you understand. You're just going through the motions. So rewriting, active. Recopying, passive. Number 4, cramming for an exam the night before. This is definitely passive. You may think you're going through the motions and doing lots of work, but actually what happens is your brain taps out. So you should do your studying in chunking. You should do it for short periods of time over a long timetable. So it's much better to do an hour a day over 7 days than it is 1 day, 7 hours straight, because your brain just taps out. It's done. So it can only hold so much at a time. So the best way to do this is short chunks. If you are going to do quite a bit in 1 day, you definitely want to do no more than 45 minutes at a time, take a break, and then come back. Number 5, previewing each chapter and developing questions. This is active for sure. Previewing means you're looking it over, you're thinking of questions, developing questions for the purpose of reading to get those answers. Number 6, make a to-do list of weekend activities during lecture. No, this is passive. Your brain took a little vacation without you. You're there, but you're thinking about other things. So although going to class is certainly important, your brain has to be there with your body. It's not enough to have a butt in a seat. Your brain has to be there with you. Otherwise, you're just going through the motions. Number 7, summarizing what you've just read and creating a mind map. Yeah, this is definitely active. Anytime you can rewrite or recreate that information in a new and different form, that's great because it's forcing your brain to think about that information. Mind maps are a great way to do this. Number 8, testing yourself on the information in your book. Yeah, this is actually good. It doesn't matter how you test yourself. The best way to do it is have someone else ask you questions. But even, if you just test yourself, write out questions yourself, and then try to answer. The trick to this is you want to test yourself before the test. You want to go into the test realizing you know the information well or not. Number 9, give a mini lecture of chapter information to an empty room. Yeah, this is active. It doesn't matter if anyone's in there or not. Going through the information aloud, orally, even to an empty room, forces your brain to think about it. It's engaging your brain. It's definitely active. And then number 10, skipping pictures and charts in the textbook because you don't have time. No, that's very passive. Quite often, pictures and charts are there to help your understanding so that you can understand the material better. So it's very important that you not skip over them. So things to think about. How do you personally stay active during either lectures or when you're reading a textbook chapter? And the big question is, do you stay active or are you just passive? Or are you just looking at things? One of the things I always try to say is you should not be reading without a writing utensil in your hand. You should be engaging, whether underlining, marking, circling, writing notes, something while you are reading. Because if you're not actively engaged. Think about what do you do when you read, and if you're doing anything. I would challenge you, if you're not doing anything when you read, it's passive. And so therefore, your level of understanding is going to be quite a bit lower than if you are actively engaged with the text. So although reading is not natural, we are not natural readers, you're not born that way, You are a natural learner. You are born naturally. Your brain likes to learn, it wants to learn. And so what learning involves is growing dendrites, and then they're connecting them at related synapses. And essentially you're building stable neural networks. So those dendrites connect and a neural network is formed, and that's how messages are passed, and that's how you are getting information. So it's very important whenever you get new information, it forms a dendrite. When you learn something new, it forms a dendrite. But much like the old saying, use it or lose it, if you do not reinforce those dendrites right away, they'll disappear if you don't use them. So it's really important when you get new information, either from a class or from reading, whatever, you reinforce that information as quickly as you can and as often as you can to make sure it's reinforced. It's kind of like a path in the woods. When you create a path in the woods, it's very difficult. And, you're cutting down trees or branches or whatever, or bending twigs as you're walking through. The next time, if you use that exact same path, it gets a little easier. And then if you continue using that path, pretty soon there's a very well-worn path and it's very easy to travel on. That is really what you want to do when you get new information. You want to reinforce that and make sure you do that as soon as you can. That's why it's the best after class to rewrite your notes or go over your notes, those kinds of things while it's fresh. So dendrites are kind of like, if you think of trees, branches, twigs, and each brain cell has an axon, and that's like a trunk of a tree, and there's many neurons, branches or twigs or terminals that are axons that are like roots. So where those neurons connect are called synapses. We talk about firing them. And when the neurons all connect, it forms a network called the neural network. So the more you know, the larger, the fuller the network becomes. So people who are experts in something have a very full neural network in that area. And it's very important that those dendrites are developed in that particular area. So just because you are smart with maybe cars does not mean that you are smart, quote unquote, with, I don't know, something like writing or math or something like that. Some things are certainly related, but the point is you may have a very well-developed neural network on specific items and not as much on other items. So when synapses work well, neurons are able to connect, and that is what's possible for you to remember things. So your goal is to connect them and fire it till you wire it so that you can get that information when you want it. So this is a picture of dendrites and the cell body. You can see the axon, the long trunk with nerve endings at the bottom. So this is an example of where a dendrite starts down at the bottom right. It starts as just this little kind of seedling, and you can see it's growing, and you can see the branches and the twigs are starting to expand. And as you are adding information and you're building a neural network, this is what a very well-developed neural network would look like. And you can kind of see all the different paths. I always think of it as like when you live in a city, and if one road's blocked, you know there are multiple paths to get to a place. So this is like that in your brain, in the fact of, if there's multiple paths to information, it's much easier to recall that information when you need it. And this is what a well-developed neural network would look like. So the natural human learning process, NHLP, this is what we call, the process of learning. And as I said before, even though you are not born reading, it's not natural to read, it's a learned process. You are born knowing how to learn. Your brain loves learning. It's natural to learn. It knows how to learn. And the sequence is this. There are 6 steps in the sequence. The first is motivation. Motivation is you got to want it. There has to be a desire to do it. Without that desire, it doesn't really happen. I always use the analogy of learning to tie my shoes. So each of us kind of learn to tie our shoes at different stages, different ages. Some of us learn very young, some quite a bit older. My example is that I didn't learn to tie my shoes till probably 9 years old, really old. Not that I was unable to, but essentially I didn't really have a desire to. They had these things called slip-on shoes, they had Velcro. I didn't really desire it, but Then, I forget what grade it was, fourth or fifth grade, they came out with these new brand called Nike. And I wanted a pair of Nike, but they were very expensive. And so my parents said, I'm not buying it until you show me you can tie your shoes. Well, I learned within an hour and thus got my Nikes, but I wasn't motivated till that point. So you have to think about that. If you're going to learn anything, what's your motivation? What's your motivation for learning? You can't think of a motivation. That's going to really be a hindrance. In other words, if you don't want to, if there's no desire to, you're going to really have difficulty in learning something. The second step is practice. Practice is clunky, it's ugly, it doesn't feel comfortable. You're practicing to get better at it, essentially. And you don't get better without practice. It's like anything. Michael Jordan didn't get to be Michael Jordan without practice. And then the interesting step after that is you do more practice. Now, the first practice is just to essentially understand how to do it. The second, more practice, you start to improve and you begin to gain confidence. You become to feel more sure. Then four is more practice after that, in which you develop even more understanding and you're getting success. So you're having more success. And then fifth, this is where you become skilled. You start to develop skill, more skill. You have more success than that, and it becomes more natural. So if you think about maybe riding a bike, when you first practice, you fall, it hurts, you don't like it. You get more practice, you start standing up a little bit better, you don't fall as often, you start to get more confident. Through that confidence, you get more practice and you understand how to keep your balance a little bit better, and you're getting success. Now you can go maybe 10 feet. And then fifth, with skill, at this point, you are able to ride the two-wheeler and you're able to do it for longer periods of time. It becomes more natural. You don't have to think about every step. It becomes more automatic. And then finally, six is mastery. The mastery label, you're actually able to teach it to someone else, teach them how to do it, and then you're able to build on it and apply it to other areas. So one of the key factors in making brain connections, managing your attention. So there are two types of attention. There's selective and selective attention means it's focused, it's on one thing. And divided is the other. And divided, of course, means your attention is not on one thing. It's on two or more things. So selective attention is focused attention, and that's directing the brain's attention to a task. So one of the biggest things of helping you in your understanding and with reading and with understanding information with lecture is paying attention with interest. If you have an interest in something, it's one of the most important keys in success for getting it into memory. It's not enough just to go through the motions with something. You do need to direct the brain's task to it. So just like in class, if you just come to class and your brain's not there, a lot of stuff will not get into memory. In order to wire information, the brain does require attention. And science shows selective attention is better. It will get into memory better than divided attention. So one of the things to do selective attention is you have to learn to fight distractors. The first thing is you have to be able to understand there are two types of distractors, internal and external. Internal means anything from inside, within. External means it comes from outside, the environment, those kinds of things. So if you ask yourself, how can I fight distractors? Well, the first thing is you have to identify them. You got to know what they are, be aware. Journaling helps with this, and journaling means you document things that are happening. Here are some other strategies to do. One is this check mark system. So as you are reading in a textbook or an article or whatever, stop every paragraph. So read a paragraph and then stop. Cover the information and then either write down the information on a separate piece of paper, what you think the author wants you to know in your own words, or say it aloud in your own words. And you got to be able to do this without looking back or any of that kind of stuff. If you can do that, then you are focusing your attention pretty well on that. If you can't, put a little check mark and then reread it. And do this through your entire passage, through the textbook. The more checks you are, the more you realize you got to really manage your attention. So if you cannot cover the information and either orally say it out loud in your own words, what the meaning is, what the most important points are, or write it out on a separate piece of paper without looking back, again, in your own words, that is a red flag for where your brain's attention is, which means it's not where it needs to be. What helps is make sure you have a learning environment that is conducive to this. Learning environment means eliminate distractors, things like electronics, other people, that type of thing. Make sure you do a daily reading or study plan. The daily reading and study plan is very important, especially in the college arena, in the fact of it's nothing. I mean, it's very common for instructors to assign full chapters to read by the next section, or 2 or 3. A lot of times you'll have a test on 2 or 3 chapters at a time. If you're not doing daily reading in small chunks and you try to read that all at once, like I said, your brain taps out. So you definitely need to have a reading plan where you're doing reading every single day for every single class. Just an FYI, listening to music is not a good way to help fight boredom, or help you focus. It actually distracts you subliminally. So the caveat here, though, is music without words. So if there's no human voice singing, then you're probably fine. That actually is very conducive to the brain. So things like classical music, jazz, anything if there's not anyone singing. But if there is, your favorite song being played or whatever, that is a subliminal distractor. And all it does is it makes it harder for your brain to focus and retain information. Learning is state dependent, which means anything that affects your senses or your brain. So there are environmental effects that come into play. So this is why you take a test in the same physical environment as you studied. So therefore you want to study in a quiet, calm environment. It's not going to be a party atmosphere than when you do a test in the classroom. So mimicking that environment that you study into the test environment is very helpful. Emotional effects. Memory and learning are state dependent. So if you're in a sad state, you're going to remember sad events. Those are triggers for you. And it cycles in a downward spiral. So as much as possible, put positive emotions with studying and learning as much as possible. This is where study groups can help. Make friends through a study group. You might even look forward to studying at some point and make some new friendships. If you're focused and calm when you study, you are more likely to recall information. Be confident and calm when you review, and confident and calm when you take the test. Claim that state of mind. Pathway effects. Remember, it's easier to recall if you remember the way you took it in. So if you can remember the information either through a diagram or a drawing, bring that diagram drawing to mind. If you can hear the instructor's voice talking about things, it's very helpful for you to create visuals to enhance those pathways. Remember, the more pathways you use, the more likely it will go into memory, which means you want to do as much as you can with visual and auditory, as well as kinetic. Study the information, outline on your own, add it, pair up with a student, quiz each other. These hit both visual and auditory pathways. The more pathways you can go over with the information, the more likely you are to be able to get it into long-term memory. So things that will enhance your reading, if you start with skimming, look over titles, headings, those kinds of things. At the beginning, you're just skimming, you're not really deep reading. Rereading is a good thing to help you improve your comprehension. Remember, comprehension means your understanding. So rereading to help you understand information is good. Rereading to help you remember or memorize information is bad. Subvocalization, this is reading aloud. This is fantastic. It hits both pathways, visual and auditory. And then pacing, don't forget fingertip. A lot of times your brain gets overwhelmed with a lot of words on a page. Pacing, use your finger to follow along to keep it, or even better, use a paper or card to block things and just read one line at a time. So when you go to study, this is called reviewing your information. And you want to use more than one strategy. Use a variety. Don't just do it one way. Remember, more pathways, the more times you can go over something, the better it is. More likely you're going to recall it because you'll have it better into long-term memory. Make sure you space out your studying. The brain processes and retains information better if you do it in shorter amounts of time over a longer period. For example, an hour a day over 5 days instead of 2.5 each. Reading information is not studying. You read to understand, you review and study. So remember, you have to be active. If all you're doing is looking things over, that is not active, and it is also not going to help you get it into long-term memory. Make sure you stay mentally positive and be very specific in setting a schedule of what you're going to study and when. The brain will be more likely to follow through if you give yourself a schedule and you actually commit it and write it down.